Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Timothy Marbun, and on behalf of the team, I would like to welcome you to the launch of the World Bank Indonesia's latest report, Indonesia Economic Prospects, a Green Horizon Toward a High Growth and Low Carbon Economy. It is my honor to host and launch the discussion today. Our event will continue until 11 a.m. Jakarta time in the morning, and in this event, we will hear remarks from World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kakonen, and also remarks from Bapak Stephen Scott, Deputy Head of Mission from the Australian Embassy in Indonesia. We will then get the chance to hear the keynote speech by the Finance Minister of the Republic of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. We then continue with a presentation on Indonesia's economy by lead economist, World Bank Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Bapak Habib Rab. And we are also fortunate to have the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Arifin Tasrif, to deliver his keynote speech. This will then be continued by a presentation on energy transition, which will be delivered by lead energy specialist, World Bank Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Bapak Stefan Garnier. We will also have a panel discussion today, moderated by Regional Director Infrastructure World Bank East Asia and Pacific, Bapak Ranjit Jelameh, and the panelists include Bapak Edwin Nugraha Putra, Executive Vice President Electricity System Planning PT Perusahaan Listrik Negara PLN. Also, we have Bapak Kam Ho, Managing Director Australia and Indonesia Total Eren, and also Bapak Rino Dono Saputro, Vice Chairman ASEAN Standard Chartered Indonesia. The options of using Bahasa Indonesia or English are also available on your screen. You may switch the language during any part of our event. Jadi bagi Anda yang ingin
For those of you who would like to hear this in Indonesia or English, you can select the interpretation channel from your bottom Zoom screen and select Indonesia or English.
Immediately right after the event, you need to be registered as media to take part in it. So please choose the press conference option on the screen to join this. Now we invite all of you to follow the World Bank Indonesia Twitter account @BankDunia and also join the conversation. Please use the hashtag #IEPBankDunia in social media. Ladies and gentlemen, the event today will start with remarks from World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kakonen. A very good morning to you, Ibu Satu. How are you? I think you're still muted, Ibu Satu. Okay. Screen is yours, Bu Satu.
Of the Indonesia economic prospects. And let me start by acknowledging our distinguished speakers. Ibu Sri Mulyani, Minister of Finance, Bapak Arifin, Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, Mr. Stephen Scott, Deputy Head of Mission to Indonesia, Australian Embassy, Bapak Edwin, Executive Vice President, PLN, Mr. Kam Ho, Managing Director of Australia and Indonesia, Total Eren, and Papa Doni, Vice Chairman ASEAN and President Commissioner Standard Chartered Indonesia. And I would also like to thank Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their continued support for the World Bank analytical work in Indonesia. We have weathered together 2 difficult years of the pandemic so far, and unfortunately it seems that this will continue still for a while. But we have also learned a great deal of lessons from this health and economic crisis. I would like to highlight 4 key lessons that we have learned and that can help mitigate the crisis going forward, prepare for an uncertain future, and build a stronger and greener economy. The first lesson is that to save lives, countries need a strong health response to contain Omicron and other variants. This requires acceleration of vaccine rollout through reliable and sufficient supplies of vaccines and therapeutics. Government's recent discussions and agreements to establish vaccine and antiviral manufacturing in Indonesia are important steps in this direction. Also, distribution bottlenecks and vaccine hesitancy would need to be addressed. Sufficient testing and contract tracing are essential to strengthen disease surveillance and to help target vaccination and mobility restrictions. And adequate hospital beds, critical care equipment such as ventilators and oxygen, and skilled human resources are essential to improving patient treatment and to reduce morbidity. The second lesson is that it is important to make adequate support to households and firms to help them cope and rebound from this pandemic. On the monetary policy front, Indonesia has space to maintain low nominal interest rates still for a while. But it is also critical that authorities continue monitoring global and domestic economic conditions and are ready to adjust that strategy as needed. On the fiscal side, the priority is to meet pandemic needs and ensure medium-term fiscal sustainability by making fiscal support more effective and raising more tax revenues. Better targeting and reprioritization of fiscal support to the poor and vulnerable and to micro, small, and medium enterprises would help improve effectiveness of the fiscal response. Large firms can get financing from commercial banks. At the same time, the implementation of recently approved tax harmonization law is critical to address low tax revenues. The third lesson is that structural reforms are critical to put the economy on a more competitive and inclusive development path. Indonesia has enacted important reforms during this crisis, and these include the Omnibus Law for Job Creation, the Tax Harmonization Law, and the Intergovernmental Fiscal Transfer Law. These reforms stand out in the whole of East Asia and among emerging markets. We applaud the government for their timely action. But to reap the full benefits from these reforms, other complementary reforms to open Indonesia to trade and investments, reverse learning losses, and accelerate the development of the digital economy would be important to pursue next. The fourth and final lesson from the crisis is the importance of addressing climate change. If we don't, our world will be exposed to more disasters such as heat waves, forest fires, floods, and pandemics. Lowering carbon emissions is a priority for the whole world, including Indonesia. The government of Indonesia has committed to cut carbon emissions by 41% by 2030, contingent on international support, and to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. In the energy sector, Indonesia has also committed to phasing out coal-fired power plants and to accelerate the introduction of renewables. And the aim is to reach net carbon neutrality in the forest and land sector by 2030. These are welcome and laudable commitments. The key challenge is how to translate these commitments into effective actions while advancing Indonesia's broader development goals. Indonesia has a broad economic and social development agenda that also needs to continue. It cannot wait. Indonesia has already initiated many noteworthy actions, such as enacting carbon pricing mechanisms and programs on peatlands, mangroves, and forest conservation and restoration. But specifically in the energy sector, more actions will be needed to reach Indonesia's climate goals. And I'm delighted that we have a very distinguished panel to discuss this issue this morning and to make some recommendations for energy transition. In the case of energy, we see two critical sets of climate actions, climate mitigation actions for Indonesia. The first set includes those that Indonesia can take on its own to reform its policies to promote green transition. The second involves global cooperation, and the two are interdependent. The set of actions that Indonesia can take on its own include improving the sector coordination, planning, regulation, and financial sustainability. This includes improving the enabling environment for private sector and private investment to come into renewable energy, because the government doesn't have adequate resources to finance the transition alone. Three reforms are essential for private investors to come in. First, the reform of coal and energy subsidies. Second, removal of controls on renewable energy prices. And third, allowing flexibilities for investors to purchase globally inputs needed for renewable acceleration. These three issues are currently keeping investors away. There is also a need to develop a comprehensive economic plan to help people and communities transition to a greener economy and to green jobs. This includes unleashing new sources of growth, as well as providing social assistance and active labor market programs. The second key action in the energy area is to promote global cooperation to promote technology transfer and financing to Indonesia. This is also important because emissions don't recognize country borders, and thus global action and cooperation is essential. My colleagues Habib Rab and Stefan Garnier will elaborate on our assessment and recommendations for Indonesia to reach its green horizon of high growth and carbon emissions. And I'm very pleased that we have such a distinguished set of high-powered keynote speakers and panelists with us today. I'm very grateful for your time, Ibu Ani, Pak Arifin, Pak Steve, Pak Edwin, Pak Kamho, and Pak Doni. We look forward to hearing your insights and recommendations for Indonesia. I hope that you all will enjoy the rest of the event. Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih Ibu Satu for delivering your opening remarks today. Esteemed guests, next is remarks from Bapak Stephen Scott, Deputy Head of Mission from the Australian Embassy in Indonesia. Good morning, Mr. Scott. Thank you for joining us today.
Selamat pagi, Timothy.
Selamat pagi. Good day to you too. The screen is yours, Mr. Scott.
Selamat pagi dan yang terhormat Menteri Keuangan Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati dan Menteri Energi dan Sumber Daya Mineral Bapak Arifin Tasrif, yang terhormat Direktur Bank Dunia Ibu Satu Kakanan, yang terhormat Kepala Badan Kebijakan Fiscal Bapak Febrio Nathan Kacaribu, dan para pembicara yang saya hormati. Terima kasih kepada Bank Dunia atas penyelenggaraan acara peluncuran laporan Indonesia Economic Prospect yang kedua pada tahun ini. Saya akan melanjutkan dalam bahasa Inggris. I'm very excited today to attend the launch of the December 2021 Indonesia Economic Prospects Report. Since the start of the pandemic, these reports have helped us all to better understand the economic impacts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the policies needed to continue to support economic recovery. Australia is proud to support the World Bank to prepare the IEP reports as part of our broader support to Indonesia. We've been supporting these reports for more than a decade now, but their contributions have never been more relevant than they have during the pandemic. More broadly, Australia has remained a dependable partner for Indonesia throughout the pandemic. Early on, we pivoted our development cooperation programs to support Indonesia's health response. We have now shifted some of our focus to supporting Indonesia's economic recovery, while still also sustaining our support for important health measures. I also want to highlight the report's important chapter on a greener horizon towards a high growth and low carbon economy. This is a growing area of cooperation between Australia and Indonesia. On the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Rome recently, Prime Minister Morrison and President Widodo agreed a joint statement on cooperation on green economy and energy transition. This acknowledges our mutual desire to address climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, setting out our joint ambition to work more closely to develop, finance and deploy affordable low emissions technologies and infrastructure, as well as building a resilient renewable energy supply chain and economies and driving green investment. In addition, Australia and Indonesia will build on the landmark Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement to cooperate on regional energy trade, carbon markets and accessible green finance. And in closing, I'd again like to thank the World Bank for producing another insightful economic update. I'm also very excited to see the powerful lineup of speakers we have today, and I really hope everyone enjoys the presentations. Terima kasih dan selamat berdiskusi.
Mr. Scott, thank you once again for your opening remarks and your support from the Australian Embassy. Just a reminder to our audience, if you want to join the conversation on social media, please follow our Twitter account @BangDunia. And for conversing today on today's event, please use the hashtag #IEPBangDunia. Our next session, ladies and gentlemen, is a keynote speech by the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who is joining us live today. Good morning, Ibu Sri Mulyani. Thank you very much for your time with us. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Timothy. Very good morning to you and to all audience.
Thank you, Ibu Sri Mulyani, for joining us. The screen is yours, Minister.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih. Selamat pagi, Ibu Sabtu Kakonen, Country Director of Indonesia and Timor Leste dari Bank Dunia. Selamat pagi kepada Pak Stephen Scott yang tadi barusan atas nama pemerintah Australia. Selamat pagi Pak Arifin Tasrif, Bapak Menteri Energi,
Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Habib Rab, the lead economist who will present about the Indonesia economic prospect, and all of the distinguished guests. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I have been following the two previous speakers. They are using Bahasa Indonesia and continue to English. So thank you very much for your invitation to me.
World Bank for launching this Indonesia Economic Prospect edition December 2021. The theme of this report is very timely. There is a green horizon toward a high growth and low carbon economy. This is the area which the government gave a very high focus and priority on the theme of recovery as well as the green recovery. Satu has already mentioned earlier that the necessary condition for all countries to recover is how we can handle COVID. So Indonesia also still continue focusing on this COVID as the necessary condition for us to be able to continue recover together and recover stronger, like the theme that we've already put on our G20 presidency. This has been a very tough, unprecedented 2 years for Indonesia and the world with this pandemic, COVID-19. And we still continue witnessing the changing variant. This year, we are very affected, like many other more than 130 countries affected by Delta variant, which put a little bit pressure on the recovery process on our economy. We also see now the new variant, Omicron, which is still continue to be a variant of interest, which we still also don't know how this is going to affect, whether it's going to be as serious and as damaging like Delta variant, or a much mild than the Delta variant. So what the Indonesia doing at this very moment, although we are in a very, very good situation, the number of daily cases has dropped to around 200 cases per day, very, very small for the population as big as Indonesia. And also the total active case reached 574,000 on July, which is now dropped to only 5,000. So this is showing that the Indonesia population, as well as then the activity, can be normalized. because we can see that the Delta variant as well as the COVID has been at least contained or controlled. It doesn't mean that we are complacent. The president, in fact, after this afternoon is going to convene all the governor as well as the mayor and bupati in order to remind that the COVID is still here. The vaccination is not yet finished, although we accelerated. We also need to continue vigilant and adopting health discipline. I think this is one of the key in which we can continue, maintain, and control the COVID, while on the other hand, we are going to be able to also normalize or improve the economic activity. This is one of the areas that the strategy that the government will continue doing. As of now, the president also instructed that the vaccination will also reach to the children. That is for the children between 6 to 11, which is going to be launched this month. We also targeted for the most vulnerable, especially those who's the older, as well as the area that Satu mentioned, those which is not yet received vaccination. We've already now approaching to 53% for the second dose and 37% of the population which is being vaccinated. The support from the Fiscal on the health and especially on the vaccination and how we are going to support on the responding COVID mutation will continue very strong. We all know that this pandemic has cost people, society, economy really significantly. So we remain vigilant. Although we now very thankful that with the Indonesia ability to contain Delta variant, we do hope on the fourth quarter of this year, the economic recovery will be continue strong. Ladies and gentlemen, if we look at how the Indonesia responding to this COVID as well as to design the recovery of the economy, maybe your focus is more on the economic package and the recovery program, which last year we've already spent 40.4 billion US dollar or around 579 trillion rupiah for economic recovery and COVID related spending. This year, 2021, we increased 22% of this economic package and COVID related spending. And we see on track in terms of the absorption, and the area which is focused for the government is certainly health, especially on the vaccination, but also on testing, tracing, and treatment. We also continue increasing the capacity of our own local in terms of producing vaccine as well as on therapeutic. These are all becoming the priority for the government in order for Indonesia to be able not only managing and maintaining the situation related to the current pandemic, but we also understand that pandemic could come anytime in the future, and that's why Indonesia need to be ready. And that's why reform on the health sector now is becoming even more critical, which the Minister of Health in charge and we from the Minister of Finance fully support the design as well as the implementation of the reform. With this managing COVID, which is relatively continued, disciplined, and effective, we also witnessing the recovery of the economy in Indonesia continue and hopefully is going to be strong and not interrupted more with the COVID factors. The third quarter economic performance relatively a bit weakened because of the Delta variant, that is 3.5% growth. But we also optimistic that the fourth quarter is going to be continued strong. The whole year growth estimated to be between 3.5% to 4.0%. We also see that the progress on this trajectory is relatively widespread. And also, if you compare with the Indonesia during ASEAN financial crisis 97-98, the ability to recover, at least in the form of GDP, to the pre-crisis level has been relatively short. That is 1.5 years. During ASEAN financial crisis, it took 4 years for Indonesia to recover to the pre-crisis level. That was because the damage, mainly on the financial sector, which is not easily at that time fixed, and that's required also a time to recover. Currently, with this COVID, we continue to have a stable and resilient financial sector, and also on the production side, on the real sector. With this recovery, we also see at least improvement on employment after increase up to 7.07 on the unemployment rate last year, August 2020, due to the COVID. The unemployment level has been now declined to level 6.49%, or 9.1 million people. So we've already created more than 1.2 million new jobs, which is, I think, is a good during this recovery. We don't want to only just recover in the form of good economic indicators in the form of growth, but we want to make sure that this is create job as well as reducing poverty, which is again also a little bit pick up because of the COVID. So with that design, we just continue working relatively well. We will continue recover in 2022. Hopefully, the growth rate is going to restore above 5%. In our budget 2022, we put 5.2% for the economic growth to 2022. The role of fiscal policy is still very critical, especially during this COVID time or pandemic time. In 2020, we widened the deficit up to 6.1% of GDP as a measure to counter cyclical the shock coming from the COVID. This year, the budget was designed with a deficit of 5.7%, but due to the strong recovery as well as strong revenue commodity boom, we are expecting that the deficit will be between 5.1 to 5.4%. Much lower than what we initially designed. Next year, in 2022, we are designing our budget with a deficit 4.8% of GDP. But this design was not yet taking into account some of the reform that I'm going to explain later on taxation and the fiscal side. Budget for 2022 will continue supporting the recovery process. And that's why the area of priority, first, of course, on human capital, education, health, and social spending will receive the highest allocation on our budget 2022. I take a note what Satu mentioned earlier, that better targeting is going to be much better in terms of the impact. And I think the government is doing exactly what you just mentioned. We are continue improving our data on especially the poor family. We also now even focusing on what you call it absolute poverty by targeting kabupaten and area kota, which is the concentration of this poor absolute poverty in Indonesia. We increase the benefit that will be enjoyed by them, and certainly this is not the only way we are going to be able to address the issue of poverty. Better services, especially basic services, is going to be very critical because equality on the access of services is going to be very critical on the poverty reduction. And that's why education and health reform are very critical. And that's exactly what is the priority of our budget. So these are the areas that we would like to have not only recover, but we want to be recover better. We are going to be recover that addressing the issue for especially the most vulnerable or those who potentially left behind. On the spending side, we are going to also continue the reform on the fiscal side to be able to have a better, effective, and accountable spending. That's why we are now applying zero-based budgeting. We also urging and also asking ministries to be able to have a more efficient, well-targeted, and focus aligned well with the national priority. We've already now applying many of what you call KPI for this spending effectiveness. I do hope that we are going to be able to continue maintaining first on the nominal level the total spending for the Indonesia, but the most important is on how we are going to allocate and implement those expenditure or the envelope that is already allocated to support both ministry as well as local government. Satu has already mentioned about two very important reform on the fiscal side, that is on taxation, harmonizing the taxation regulation, and the second one, intergovernment fiscal transfer. This is going to be a very critical for Indonesia. First, to improve our revenue side. The tax is going to be the most important contributing to the revenue. This year, we are witnessing the recovery across the board on all sectors, but also because of the commodity boom. But we are not complacent with that. So, Parliament and the government has already agreed on the package of reform on a taxation, which include on the administration procedure, simplifying it, income tax, which is providing more for especially for the highest bracket household, to have a higher tax income rate, and also for us to continue maintain the corporate income tax at 22%. We also introduced quite a significant reform on a VAT, which is trying to address the issue of loophole, and at the same time still continue providing the affirmative attention for the most vulnerable or basic need. So these are all hopefully is going to provide a much stronger foundation for Indonesia on the revenue side. We also working together at the global level with the global minimum taxation, as well as the reform related to the carbon tax, which is totally new on for Indonesia taxation regime. So these are all reform that we conducted even during this COVID time, during this pandemic time, because we don't see crisis as just devastating a factor that affect negatively our economy and people, but we see crisis as an opportunity to build Indonesia stronger and better. And that's why we use this opportunity to continue pushing our reform. On a local government or intergovernment local transfer, this is going to be also a very critical within the spending side of our fiscal. We are going to make sure that the accountability of the transfer by the local government will be implemented. You all know that 1/3 of our spending is actually through the local government. And that's why the competency, the capacity, accountability, governance at the local level is very critical for us to be able to make sure that 1/3 of our spending will be able to reach to the people in the form of benefit. And that's why within this reform, we are putting quite a heavy emphasis on the accountability and the performance. This will hopefully create what we call it the state of the nation, in which the basic services for people in Indonesia, no matter where you live, no matter who you are, is going to be relatively the same. So this can address the issue of horizontal imbalances as well as vertical imbalances within the state union of Indonesia. We also still continue implementing the reform on the real sector, as Satu mentioned, that this is very critical. I think you mentioned about the job creation law, which is currently need to be addressed with the Constitutional Court decision. But we are optimistic that this is going to create certainty, because Indonesia, both parliament as well as the government working in order for us to be able to continue comply both on a formal level as well as material level on this reform with our constitution. On the other area that you mentioned, that Indonesia need continue to address openness, I think this is exactly what Indonesia is doing. The transformation of the economy in Indonesia could not be achieved without openness, whether this is on a trade as well as investment. But Indonesia need to transform. We cannot just stuck with the format or structure of the economy in which we are not creating value added through the downstreaming industry manufacturing in Indonesia. And you can see that now Indonesia is continue improving on this downstreaming industry. This is exactly the area which is really creating a vulnerability on the external side of the Indonesia. That is hollow middle on our industry. We have a natural resource rich, but we don't have enough competitive and productive downstream industry. And then we have a huge market domestically. So these are all exactly what President Jokowi now try to address. Investment climate is become a key. And that's why we are implementing the job creation law, including, most importantly, is simplifying the investment regime so that we are going to be able to create a certainty for any investment, both domestic as well as foreign, to operate in Indonesia. These are all the area which is very critical for the recovery of Indonesia, which hopefully also accompanied by a stronger foundation and structure of the industry. Now that is the area which is related to economy. We will continue maintain this recovery process with a prudent, sound, as well as pragmatic approach on our policy. And that's already proven very, very well in putting Indonesia in a strong position. Now let me now address the issue, the last one that Satu mentioned about climate change. You are all following very closely how President Jokowi is already pledging as well as stating Indonesia commitment to this climate change challenge globally. Indonesia is the big country, both in terms of population, economy, natural resources. So we have the responsibility, and we are going to play as a responsible global community, which we are all understand that climate change is an issue that need to be addressed globally, but each country also have their own responsibility. So common but differentiated responsibility is very important. A just and affordable approach is also very critical for this climate change. That kind of principle that we try to translate within our policy framework in addressing with this climate change. You've already mentioned about the green development, especially the role of forestry and land use. I think this is the area which President Jokowi has already provided an example. Replanting and then reforestation is going to be very, very critical because it's relatively cheap, it's relatively effective in absorbing CO2, and also create a lot of jobs. So from the Indonesia point of view, this is very important. I do understand that forestry and land use is not the only and cannot fulfill the all Indonesia commitment on the reduction of the CO2. And that's why within our document of the national determined commitment, we also recognize the second most important factors, that is energy sector and transportation. On the energy, I think we've already discussed quite a lot, and I'm glad that Pak Arifin is going to also participate in this forum. From the fiscal point of view, as I mentioned, to support the energy transition as well as the green development in Indonesia, first, as I mentioned earlier, we've already recently passed the legislation introducing carbon tax as one tool. But carbon tax is only one instrument. We need to establish a carbon market which is credible, sound, and reliable in Indonesia. And this is exactly what the Indonesia government now focusing. We are already issued what we call it the economic value of carbon. I think this is the start for establishing the right and effective, credible, and sound carbon market in Indonesia. We've already also tasking PLN, electricity company, to start having a cap and trade to start this carbon market mechanism. Second one, on the budget side, we've already introduced the budget tagging on the climate since 2016 on the national budget. We are now also supporting local government in Indonesia to also starting to have a budget tagging on climate. Currently, we have 11 local government, and we will continue expand to other local government so that it will create more accountability and commitment from the fiscal side on a climate change program. We also already developing many of the special mission vehicle and blended finance platform in order for us to be able to collaborate at the global level, as Satu mentioned. That is how we are going to be able to create an effective bridge between the global interests, especially on financing, with the Indonesia own project, which is, I think, is going to be very critical. Blended finance under PTSMI is very, very important, but also the role of many of the state-owned enterprises, whether this is on a public-private partnership through the guarantee, viability gap, and other instrument is going to be critical for us to be able to support climate change program. On the other hand, we also try to address the issue on how this transition mechanism can be designed in a smooth, predictable, and just as well as affordable way. Energy transition mechanism, especially related coal, is very, very important for Indonesia. I think many other countries in the world, they are now struggling between committed to this climate change. On the other hand, they are facing with the current situation, which is not always providing them with the degree of freedom of choosing the green energy. Whether this is related to geopolitical or this is related to technology or financing, I think we recognize those challenges. But for Indonesia, we will continue design as well as preparing the right foundation. Our work with the Asian Development Bank on the energy transition mechanism is just the beginning. At least we will continue developing the building block for this policy framework so that we can recognize in a more concrete and technical way how we are going to be able to deliver this energy transition from non-renewable to become renewable. This is going to be a long process, but we have to start from somewhere, and we have to start with the right policy and regulatory framework. This is exactly what we are now trying to do, and I appreciate the World Bank also provide with many of both technical as well as policy review and recommendation. It will complement many of the effort which is already now being launched and conducted by the government. This is a very critical time for all of us. The support from the population, political party, and the commitment of President Jokowi is very, very strong on this climate change. So when you talk about the political will, it is already very, very obvious and strong in Indonesia. So the challenge now on how we are going to be able to translate this political will into a sound policy framework, regulatory framework, and a doable action. When we talk about doable, affordability is very critical. And especially don't forget that we are still in the process of recovery from this devastated pandemic COVID, which affecting our people ability and prosperity very significant. And that's why we need to make sure that people have the ability to not only withstand the shock, but also recover better. And energy is one of the most important on the prosperity of the people. And that's why we have to be very mindful for all of this. While I appreciate, of course, continuous element of technocracy, but we also have to be able to continue putting within the context of social and economic as well as political context. This will become the right formula for us to achieve the successful policy framework for the green recovery. So with that, I would like to congratulate again Bank Dunia, that is World Bank, for continue providing Indonesia with the perspective as well as policy recommendation. I think this is one of the good practice of continue having a good partnership between Indonesia government and multilateral institution like the World Bank. Thank you so much, and I do hope that you are all going to have a very productive as well as fruitful seminar today. Thank you.
Minister Sri Mulyani, thank you very much for your time and for delivering the keynote speech in our event. Ladies and gentlemen, next on our agenda is a presentation on Indonesia economic recovery led by lead economist World Bank Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Bapak Habib Rab. Now we'll take you straight to Pak Habib right after this short video.
The Indonesian economy was off to a strong start during the first half of 2021. But the COVID-19 Delta wave held back the reopening of the economy between June and August. Budget flexibility and favorable financing conditions allowed authorities to rapidly respond to the pandemic, expand social assistance, and stimulate the economy. The economy is expected to rebound by 3.7% in 2021 and to grow by 5.2% in 2022, assuming there is no new severe COVID wave. But risks are high with the spread of new COVID variants such as Omicron. Indonesia will need to tackle 4 key challenges to improve the recovery. First, contain the pandemic by continuing to accelerate the vaccine rollout and improving testing, tracing, and treatment. Second, maintain accommodative monetary and financial sector policies while preparing to adjust to changing economic conditions. Third, enhance fiscal space by increasing tax revenues and improving the targeting and prioritization of fiscal support. Fourth, complement recent structural reforms with measures to build a more competitive, inclusive, and greener economy.
Terima kasih Pak Tim, selamat pagi dan selamat datang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Excellency Bapak Arifin Tasrif, Bapak Stephen Scott, Ibu Satu Kahkonen. I'm greatly honored today to share with you an overview of our latest edition of the Indonesia Economic Prospects, which was prepared by a team led by our senior country economist Abdullah C and our country economist Indira Hapsari. I will go through 9 key messages that span our assessment of recent developments, our analysis of the economic outlook, and finally our policy recommendations. I will start with recent developments, where our headline is that though the Delta wave in July has slowed down economic growth, as Her Excellency the Minister mentioned, external conditions and policy responses have helped to cushion the shock. Our first message, therefore, is that the macroeconomy has been somewhat resilient to the health shock in July. And that resilience, we argue in the report, are mainly due to 2 main factors. The first is that external conditions, including rising demand for exports and increasing commodity prices, and the second was the policy response, which I will come back to shortly. Now, external conditions have rebalanced the sources of growth in Indonesia over the past year, which is what we try to illustrate in this first chart. So manufacturing activity and exports have been quite strong, whereas private consumption and domestic services, which tend to be more resilient during crises, have been more subdued simply because of lockdown effects. At the same time, while external conditions have helped provide a good shock absorber, the economy remains about 4% below what it could be producing, as shown in the second chart. So to close the gap will require an acceleration in private consumption and domestic services, particularly as rising trade bottlenecks and costs which are discussed in the report, will weigh on export demand. I now turn to the policy response and our second message, which is that the acceleration in vaccine rollout, which the minister mentioned, has in fact helped to reduce viral transmission and mortality. So vaccines are working. The daily vaccine inoculations almost doubled within the month of July, which we know, with very rapid progress, particularly in urban areas. And we try to illustrate this in the first chart. The government eased vaccine supply and distribution bottlenecks. It also launched communication and outreach efforts to address vaccine hesitancy. And now, as we know, close to half the population have received at least one dose of the vaccine, and there are plans to further expand that to other parts of the population, as noted by the minister. And there is evidence that this is working. As shown in the second chart, provinces that had reached higher vaccination rates by mid-July also experienced a much faster decline in cases and deaths by mid-September. And official COVID-19 cases declined, in fact, much more quickly in Indonesia compared to many other countries in the region, which allowed a gradual reopening of the economy and improvement in mobility. This brings me to my third message, which is that this health response, together with a ramping up of social assistance spending, was possible thanks to flexible fiscal policy. And in our assessment, the increase in social assistance package in response to the Delta wave in 2021 is expected to have contained the rise in poverty. In particular, we see that instead of the poverty rate rising from 10.2% in 2020 to 11.4% in 2021, we estimate that poverty probably rose to around 10.6% in 2021. And this is largely thanks to the higher social assistance spending. And we can see this in the first chart. Now, the increase in spending was in part aided by a recovery in revenues, as the minister noted, thanks to higher commodity prices and the rebound in economic activity in the second quarter. But of course, the unprecedented scale of the fiscal response nevertheless has required higher levels of financing, which pushed up central government debt from 30% of GDP to 42% between 2019 and 2020. But this remains low overall, including relative to peers, as illustrated in the second chart. This brings me to the fourth message, which is that monetary policy has been supportive of fiscal efforts, but that credit to the private sector has lagged economic activity. Now, the authorities maintained a historically low nominal policy rate. But when we look at the real policy rate, so the policy rate adjusted for expected inflation, we see that it has remained positive throughout the crisis in contrast to peers. And this is because the authorities have had to balance supporting the economy through an accommodative monetary policy with ensuring real returns for external investors. Now, in addition to lowering the policy rate, the authorities have also injected liquidity in the financial system. But money supply did not expand markedly compared to peers because private credit has remained relatively weak. In fact, as illustrated by the second chart, though credit to the government increased very rapidly, credit to the private sector has remained negative until very recently. And we've been trying to understand this better, and we know that there are both supply and demand side factors to explain this. But even if demand for financing is low, that is not because firms do not require financing. Some of the financing was met through fiscal support rather than financial sector support, and this is a policy issue that I will return to later. I now turn to the outlook, where our headline is that though the outlook is positive, there is still a great band of uncertainty and some risks of scarring. So our fifth message is that we project the economy will continue to recover through a rebalancing in its sources of economic growth. We estimate that the economy will have expanded by 3.7% in 2021 and keep growing at 5.2% in 2022. Now, this of course assumes no severe episodes of COVID-19 outbreaks and sustained progress on vaccination. This is expected to release pent-up demand and help private consumption and contact-intensive services sectors to rebound more strongly. I wanted to mention one very quick word on inflation because this has been a topic across many countries. Now, Indonesia has bucked the global trend whereby prices have remained quite low and stable, unlike other emerging markets, because of weak demand and limited pass-through of higher producer prices to consumer prices. But producer price inflation has been rising since the summer, and we project that the cost push inflation pass-through could increase in the coming months. But the resulting higher consumer price inflation is likely to remain largely within official targets because of the negative output gap discussed a little bit earlier. One more point on the outlook, which brings me to our sixth message, and that is that beyond the short-term negative effects, COVID-19 could also reduce longer-term growth through various different channels. And that includes persistent losses in growth because of unemployment and lower investment. And indeed, potential growth has declined during the pandemic. Between 2010 and 2019, potential growth has been falling, which is what we see in the first chart, not just in Indonesia, but in other countries also. And this has declined further because of lower investment during COVID. Now, we have looked at this in a little bit more detail in the IEP report by investigating the impact of the crisis on the labor market, focusing in particular on youth and young graduates. And one message I wanted to share with all of you from that report is that, as illustrated in the second chart, many youth exited the labor market and were not in employment and education and training during the COVID period. So the share of youth not in employment, education and training increased to 16.4% between February 2020 and February 2021. And these findings highlight the potentially substantial learning and skills losses during COVID-19, which also require urgent attention. So what would be our recommendations on policy priorities? In fact, many of them were already covered in Her Excellency the Minister's keynote speech, and also in Ibu Satu Kakunen's opening remarks. But I would like to highlight three in particular, with the headline that gradually we need to shift the drivers of growth from macroeconomic towards structural policies. So our first message, which brings me to our seventh message, is that there is a need to collect more and focus fiscal effort on urgent health and needs of poor households. The tax harmonization law is a very welcome step in collecting more. Now, the intention, of course, is not to burden businesses and households during a time of crisis, but to gradually plug the tax gap, the difference between what is collected and what could potentially be collected given Indonesia's economic conditions. And given how hard the spending side is working, collecting more can, in our view, have positive net effects. Secondly, and the Minister also mentioned this, fiscal support could be reprioritized to create fiscal space for some of these urgent needs. For example, fiscal support to viable firms could better be targeted to micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, while financing for large firms should come from commercial bank lending. And this would help to shift some of the balance sheet risks from the government onto the banking sector. Now, of course, the banking sector has its own risks, of course. Loans at risk have stabilized at a relatively high level. But in our view, the solution is not to stop lending. The solution should be geared towards corporate debt restructuring, some of which is already taking place. This connects to our next message, which is how the financial system could support growth rather than wait for growth before supporting the real sector. Now, banks are watching for firms and industries to recover before they start lending, rather than lending in order to support the recovery. But this, in our view, could constrain financial deepening and the quality of economic growth. The authorities are doing their part by maintaining an accommodative monetary policy. This may become more challenging as monetary policy in the US starts to normalize and normalize faster than expected, as announced by the US Fed chair just yesterday. Of course, vulnerabilities to tightening external financing conditions should be monitored closely, though I would like to note two issues in this regard. The first is that foreign exchange reserves are strong, and the real policy rate differential with the US remains positive and higher than other emerging markets, as illustrated by the first chart. Secondly, the vulnerability to capital flow sudden stops or reversals may be less, notwithstanding global market sentiments, with the decline in external financing needs and the fall in the stock of domestic assets held by non-residents, as illustrated in the second chart. This brings me to my conclusion and our final message, which is the importance of gradually shifting the drivers of growth from macroeconomic to structural policies. As macroeconomic policy space shrinks, the use of macro stimulus and its impact will gradually diminish. So if the economy overheats, as evidenced by rising inflation in other countries, then additional fiscal and monetary injections will have diminishing returns. But structural reforms can enhance the efficiency of macroeconomic policies. This includes many of the issues that the minister mentioned, and also the removal of trade restrictions, including non-tariff measures, financial sector deepening, labor and goods market efficiency, the enabling of a green economy. All of this can help to generate more growth with less fiscal and monetary support. They can also raise potential growth and help to reverse scarring. This is what we have seen in the wake of other crises in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Structural reforms were able to unleash growth even with consolidating fiscal policies. And Indonesia can build on its structural reform efforts, such as the omnibus law on job creation, the tax harmonization law, and start tackling other issues illustrated in these two charts that show the reform gap between Indonesia and other middle income economies. With this, I would like to thank you, Excellency Minister and Ibu Satu, Pa Stephen, and hand over back to you, Patim.
Presentation. Now, please allow me to take just a small part of your time to just address some issues. I would like to know your insights upon some very timely issues. First of all is, as you know, the trade disruptions and commodity prices, they're still high at the moment. Now, is inflation likely to remain low? And what should policymakers do if it does start rising?
Thank you very much, Patim. So to date, what we see is that, price pressures have come from supply side factors relative to demand side factors. So for example, trade and supply bottlenecks, commodity prices, and these are cost push drivers of inflation, which is what we are seeing to some extent in Indonesia also, where demand pull inflation is relatively low because of the domestic demand conditions I mentioned during the presentation. But as demand starts to pick up, so will price pressures, unless constraints to supply are also addressed. So what would be our advice? I think firstly our advice would be to focus on addressing short-term cost pressures by identifying structural constraints. Some pressures will be exogenous, such as global commodity prices, and difficult for policymakers to address. But others are within policymakers' control, such as trade logistics, cost of funding, access to critical imports, and others. And these reforms need to move more quickly than any adjustment to the policy rate. So once the domestic market starts to pick up through supply and demand expansion, then only would we think that an adjustment to the policy rate is appropriate.
Now, also, Habib, you mentioned the importance of raising tax revenues and mitigating climate change. The recently approved tax harmonization law addresses both priorities, including by introducing a carbon tax here. Now, what are your recommendations to make this tax an effective policy tool?
Thank you very much, Patim. I think, as the minister mentioned, the carbon tax is part of a suite of different instruments, including an emissions trading scheme. And I would say that the approach taken by the authorities is the right one, which is to start with a low rate and focus its application on one specific sector. And the reason, is that the economy is already very carbon intensive and needs time to adjust. Therefore, starting with a very high carbon price may be overly disruptive to growth. So what you want is a model of carbon pricing, to signal, to work in a way that supports the power sector and other industries eventually to move towards low carbon production. And the carbon tax provides an important signal of the authority's intention to change relative prices of different energy sources in the economy. And those price signals should incentivize a shift towards less carbon intensive production. This means that the carbon tax, in our view, would also need to be complemented by parallel and enabling measures to promote that shift. For example, access to financing to invest in green technologies, as Ibu Satu and the Minister mentioned, or another example is access to imported green technologies, so tackle trade restrictions to those green technologies, or encouraging FDI that also brings green investments.
Thank you for answering those questions, Bapak Habib Rab, and also for your presentation today.
Thank you very much, Patim.
Before we move on, a reminder to our audience that you have the option of using Bahasa Indonesia or English is available on your screen. You may switch the language at any part of our event today. Jadi bagi Anda, sekali lagi mengingatkan untuk mengikuti keseluruhan acara, Anda bisa melakukannya dalam Bahasa Indonesia. Anda tinggal memilih fitur penerjemah di bagian bawah layar Anda dan memilih terjemahan Bahasa Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear the keynote speech by the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Arifin Tasrif. To Minister Tasrif, the screen is yours.
World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kahkonen, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted and honored to be invited to speak at the e-launch of the World Bank Indonesia Economic Prospect Report. My warmest congratulations for the launching, and I am certain that this report can serve as valuable input for Indonesia's transition to low-carbon energy future. Indonesia still has a large dependence on fossil fuel. Almost 90% of our energy mix generates from fossil fuels, while renewables only hold around 11% of share. Our oil consumption is currently twice as much as our production capacity. This issue forces Indonesia to import large amount of oil, which then creates a trade deficit to our economy. It is projected that energy consumption will continue to rise despite a slight dip in 2020, which was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. To ensure energy security, availability, and affordability, Indonesia must reduce its fossil fuel dependence and utilize alternative energy such as new and renewable energy. Development of renewable energy is also aligned with our commitment towards emission reduction in energy sector, which is to cut 29 to 41% of emission in our nationally determined contribution. President Joko Widodo also has emphasized the importance of new and renewable energy development to reduce emissions, while opening prospects for green and sustainable economic growth, such as building green industrial park in North Kalimantan, increasing investment in biofuels, developing electric vehicle ecosystems, and lithium battery industry, as well as establishing a carbon market. To support the development of renewables, the Indonesian government has endorsed Electricity Supply Business Plan, or RUPTL, of 2021 to 2030 to be greener, in which we allocate 51.6% of 40.6 gigawatt additional capacity, or 20.9 gigawatt from new and renewable energy sources. New and renewable energy development is undertaken in all electrical systems in accordance with the power balance. With this plan in motion, we are on target to meet the target of 23% renewable energy mix by 2030. In addition to that, we have been developing a roadmap towards net zero emission to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 or sooner with international support. The main strategies include massive development of new and renewable energy, focusing on solar, hydro, and geothermal energy resources, while at the same time also considering the utilization of hydrogen. Reduction of fossil energy utilization through gradual retirement of coal power plants, conversion of diesel power plant into gas and renewable energy, co-firing and termination of new coal power plant development unless already contracted or under construction. The first retirement phase of subcritical will be in 2031, while the last retirement of coal power plant will be in 2057. With such strategies, it is hoped that 2060, our electricity use will come entirely from renewables, with additional capacity 587 gigawatt, largely from solar power, followed by hydro, wind, bioenergy, geothermal, and ocean. Storage technology such as battery energy storage systems, pump storage, and hydrogen, as well as nuclear power plants, will also play a key role in ensuring system reliability, even with large penetration of variable renewable energy. Aside from that, Indonesia will also develop a supergrid to enhance connectivity as the new transmission between systems and islands are required for local renewable energy resource distribution. The implementation of supergrid will overcome the divergency between local renewable energy sources and high demand locations. Moreover, it will reduce the intermittency impact of the increasing VRE generation. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, as the energy transition is rolling, the need for investment will increase even more in the long run. The total of power sector investment is projected to be more than $1 trillion by 2060. It is hoped that with the support of competitive technology, we can suppress the investment amount. Therefore, partnership with all relevant stakeholders, including private sectors, is the key towards successful energy transition. To create a better and attractive investment climate, the Indonesian government is preparing for financial instruments and schemes to fund the energy transition process, such as for phase down or phase out coal power plants and development of renewable energy infrastructures. Despite of its vast investment, it's also important to note that the development of renewable energy shall create a multiplier effect on the national economy. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, we are grateful for our long-standing cooperation with the World Bank. Hopefully, we can continue to work together and strengthen our cooperation to build back our economy and transition towards a more sustainable future.
We thank the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Arifin Tasrif, for delivering his keynote speech today. Ladies and gentlemen, next we will hear a presentation on energy transition, which will be delivered by lead energy specialist, World Bank Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Bapak Stefan Garnia. But before we head to Pak Stefan, here's a short video to lead you to the presentation.
Indonesia has made important commitments to contribute to global climate change mitigation goals. The government aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 41% by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. A third of these reductions will come from the power sector. To achieve these goals, Indonesia intends to accelerate the retirement of coal-fired power plants and introduce cleaner sources of energy. But this transition faces challenges and trade-offs. It requires significant investments. Potentially higher electricity prices would affect growth and jobs, including in coal-dependent regions. A four-pillar reform strategy can help Indonesia turn its power sector climate commitments into actions, while advancing its broader development objectives. The first is strengthening sector institutions by improving coordination, planning, and regulation. The second is enabling private investments in renewable energy by improving the regulatory environment and upgrading the electricity infrastructure. The third is ensuring the power sector's financial sustainability by improving its revenue adequacy and reducing energy subsidies. The last pillar is paving a just transition for all by developing strategies to address the potential negative socio-economic impacts of phasing down coal.
Excellency Minister Sri Mulyani, Excellency Minister Tasrif, honorable guests, Pa Febrio from BKF, Pa Dharmawan from PLN, Pa Kam Ho from Total Eren, and Pa Rino from Standard Chartered. Ibu Satu and Pa Ranjit, participants, Salamat Pagi and good morning. My name is Stéphane Garnier. I am the World Bank Lead Energy Specialist for Indonesia and also the Infrastructure Program Leader. As you all know, energy transition, our today's special topic, is of real importance. It has been at the center of discussion between all world leaders recently in Glasgow for the COP26 and is becoming a priority for most of the countries, including for Indonesia. Government has recently made ambitious commitments toward the reduction of GHG emission and has made additional announcements in Glasgow. Today we will discuss the constraints, some options and a few recommendations to put the energy sector on the right path to a successful transition and decarbonization. Indonesia's energy sector has made a lot of progress in the last 20 years. Indonesia has nearly reached universal access over the last 20 years, and they have connected 34 million of customers in the past 10 years. They have increased installed capacity from 40 gigawatt in 2011 to 61 gigawatt in 2020. PLN is present in over 600 islands and is considered one of the strongest utilities in the region. But this has come at the cost of environment. Coal power capacity has doubled in just 10 years. Coal usage has increased significantly. Emission increased by 140% between 1990 and 2017, and emission intensity is twice the average of the intensity in G20 countries. Indonesia's energy sector is also facing several challenges. PLN's financial sustainability is challenged by a number of factors. First, the revenue structure is not adequate by not providing enough revenue to support all their requirements and support the huge financing requirement they will need to support in the coming 10 years. Tariff is not at the right level, significantly below the cost of service. There is also a fragmented sector regulation challenges with different stakeholders having different objectives and pushing PLN sometimes in different directions. Indonesia is also lagging behind its peers in variable renewable energy deployment and has yet to adopt standards of automation and digitalization for its grid. Coal and fuel subsidies, as well as renewable energy pricing distortion, constrain the mobilization of the private sector, and the coal phase down is likely to have measurable economic and social impact, including in coal-dependent regions. In the wake of COP26, Indonesia's government made new climate commitment. They have committed to reduction by 26% from business as usual unconditionally. And with support from international community, they committed to have a reduction of 41%. They also committed to reach a mix of 23% of renewable by 2025. They are currently at 12%, which means that the challenge is very, very high. They are also committed to reach a net zero by 2060 or earlier. And in terms of coal, they have committed to not make new commitments for new coal-fired power plants after 2022, and they only plan to add 13.8 gigawatt compared to 28 gigawatt in the previous plan, and they plan to have a full phase down of coal by 2056, but as announced in Glasgow, they might try to accelerate this total phase down in the 2040s. They also plan to have this accelerated retirement in the next 10 years by reaching a minimum of 8 gigawatt of coal-fired plant retired. The newer UPTL that has been approved in September this year significantly reduces the planned coal capacity, but also increase significantly the share of renewable. For the first time in its history, PLN plans to build more renewable energy projects in the coming 10 years than thermal generation. They plan to add more than 20 gigawatt of renewable energy. The technology that will be used are mostly hydropower, including pump storage, geothermal, photovoltaic, wind, and biomass. Gas and coal will see their share reduce in the next 10 years, and the government also plans to retire completely diesel generation that are still prominent in the small and medium-sized islands. But decarbonization faces several challenges in Indonesia, and all options will need to be explored. First, there is limited space to integrate renewable, especially in the big system like Java Bali. There is also a complex island grid situation limiting potential for imports. Currently, there is an excess power that might create potential carbon lock-in. And there are some regulatory impediments that we will discuss further in the next slides. But there are some options available. At the World Bank, we have made some modeling, and we have studied several scenarios to decarbonize the sector. We have focused on the Java Bali system, and we have studied three possible scenarios. As business as usual, we have taken the last RUPTL, covering the period of 2021 to 2030, that we have extended to 2040. Then we have studied a coal phase down scenario where we would retire coal power plants after 20 years. And we have studied a more aggressive decarbonization scenario with a cap of a cut of 70% of reduction by 2040. The coal phase down scenario shows that emission would be cut by 40% in 2040, and that would add 6% to the cost of the business as usual without taking into account the cost of coal phase down. Under the more ambitious scenario, meaning a cut of 70% by 2040, the additional cost would be of 27%. But to achieve this possible scenario, there will be a need of a number of reforms. A comprehensive reform program will be needed, and here are a few recommendations. First, decarbonization planning, sector efficiency and performance will need to be improved. It will be important to align strategy and targets across government agencies. It will be also important to have the appropriate pathway to phasing down coal with innovative financing mechanism, and it will be also very important to look at possible new technologies or possible new options to accelerate decarbonization. Interconnection between islands, international interconnection will need to be studied further. Carbon capture and storage might help reducing further the emissions. And it will be also important to look at possible new technology that might play in the coming years a big role, like hydrogen. It will be also important to improve sector coordination. We propose the creation of a new interministerial commission that would help aligning environmental, financial, and fiscal targets. To improve efficiency, we think that it will be useful to separate system planning, generation procurement, and system operation from the core PLN's activities. The creation of a single barrier model or the transmission system operator should be studied and implemented in the coming year if proven useful and feasible. Clean energy deployment will also need a number of changes in the regulation. It will be first important to develop clear medium-term VRE deployment targets with associated tender timeline. This will help PLN benefit from low photovoltaic and wind power prices. There are also a number of regulations that will need to be removed or reformed to boost private sector investment. First, reducing local content requirements, at least for photovoltaic and wind. Phasing out coal and fuel subsidies will be also very important, so that all technologies will play on the same level field. And then lifting renewable energy price control will be needed. We know that there is a presidential regulation for renewable energy pricing that is under discussion, and this will be a big changer for renewable. New investment will also be needed in grid flexibility, and appropriate pricing mechanism will have to be developed. Regarding the financial sustainability of the sector, it will be also an essential point that will have to be discussed and will have to be developed. Because without that financial stability, it will be impossible for the sector to finance the huge investment program that is in front of the sector. Setting the appropriate revenue requirements is critical for the financial viability of PLN, but also for PLN to raise the financing necessary. Increasing the share of revenue received from tariff through a subsidy reform is also very important. Public service obligation will need to be reformed, but also reinstated progressively. The automatic tariff adjustment will be needed to reduce the share of support from the government to PLN. That might allow the government to use the savings to support more renewable. PLN will also need to explore new financing schemes and sources. And it will be important, and we know they are already working on it, to develop an environmental and social and governance framework that will help them raising more financing internationally and locally. Lastly, phasing down the use of coal will require a just transition for the people, for communities, for businesses which rely on Indonesia's coal industry. And the World Bank has developed a methodology to support this just transition that we think would be necessary to start developing as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gardia, for delivering the presentation on energy transition today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will now head on to the panel discussion on Indonesia's strategy to maintain growth and move closer to be a low-carbon economy. If you want to join the conversation in the social media, please follow our Twitter account @BankDunia and use the hashtag #IEPBankDunia. I will now hand the floor to our moderator, Regional Director Infrastructure, World Bank, East Asia and Pacific, Bapak Ranjit J. Lameh. Bapak Ranjit, the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Timothy. I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have an exciting panel comprising 4 individuals who represent the banking sector, the private renewable sector, from the government, from the Ministry of Finance, and from PLN. So let me first introduce Park Febrio. Park Febrio is the chairman of the Fiscal Policy Agency of the Ministry of Finance. Clearly, the Ministry of Finance is going to play a very important role in the energy transition, and we will hear from him on several aspects of this transition and what would be needed. We also have Park Rino Dono Sepetro. Now, Park Rino is been in the banking line for the last quarter century or more. He is the Vice Chairman of Standard Chartered for ASEAN. He was previously the CEO for Standard Chartered Indonesia and has an illustrious career in banking across all of Asia as well as in the UK and elsewhere, and well positioned to give us insights on aspects of private financing and particularly from the lender side. We also have Park Edwin from PLN, who is the Executive Vice President of the System Planning part of PLN, who's again had a long career in the power sector and with PLN, and has moved on to different roles, taken on different roles, and clearly PLN is at the center of the energy transition, and we'll hear from him on different aspects. We also have Park Samho, who's the Managing Director for Total Eren. He has spent a large part of his career, or most of his career, developing renewables across the Asia Pacific region as well as in Australia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each one of them a series of 3 questions, and it's sort of broken up into first to understand the challenges for the energy transition from their respective perspective, and also then we move on to what they see as the ingredients or successful ingredients in energy transition, and finally in the third round to ask them what they see their roles, and their roles are extremely critical in the energy transition. So to kick the session off, I'm going to pose the same question to all 3 of you. So let me start with asking each one of you, and I will start with, in this instance, Park Febrio, then we will go to Park Reno, and finally we will go to Park Febrio is not there, so we will start with Park Reno to give us a perspective from the lending side on what do they see as the main challenges for the energy transition. We'll move on to Park Cobb and then finally to Park Edwin for this first round. And if you could limit your interventions to about a minute or so, or minute and a half, that would be good. Then I'll move on to the next question. Over to you, Park Reno.
Thank you, Ranjit, and a very good morning. I hope I'm audible actually to you.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you actually, and greetings to all of the other speakers here. It's a great opportunity actually to share some thoughts actually in this forum. So from the outset, we've heard actually all of the presentations and remarks from Ibu Satu, Ibu Sri Mulyani, and Pak Arifin. Indonesia's decarbonization journey is definitely the right way to go, but it will not be an easy feat. Look, in an environment of rapid economic expansion, population growth, soaring demand for energy, the country must find ways to embrace clean power sources, boost energy efficiency, and encourage clean electricity use. And in order to do this, the government must internalize climate change into the national agenda, attract finance for significant infrastructure and technology investment, and adopt the right energy pricing policy for renewable sources. Now, among these complexities, I just would like to highlight from a lender's perspective, perhaps actually 3 key obstacles that we foresee. So first, I think we should look at the reality of the fundamental challenge faced by all emerging countries, including Indonesia, in pursuing their sustainability agenda and or decarbonization pathways, which is the enormous amount of capital that it would require to support an effective execution of the net zero plans. Well, many investors, corporations, financial institutions announced their commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and net zero capital is not flowing at the required speed to the countries where sustainability investment is needed the most. So in emerging markets alone, UN estimates 3.9 trillion per year will be required to reach all the 17 goals by 2030. And there's a gap of 2.5 trillion per year that's actually happening now. On the other hand, this represents the opportunity for the private sector, but that's a separate thing altogether. So the issue here is the scale of capital required is unprecedented and nothing like we have ever seen before. We at Standard Chartered, we did a survey ourselves actually at the end of last year called the $50 trillion question. So essentially we spoke with around 300 asset managers with a combined AUM of $50 trillion. That's more than half of the world's GDP in search of answers relating to sustainable financing. And interestingly, the research shows that global investors are generally underinvested in emerging markets, with at least 2/3 of their AUM currently still invested in the developed markets. So, I mean, they cited risk actually in emerging markets, investments, whether it's financial, economic, political, actually as some of the main majority barriers, if you will. Now, almost 3/4 of the investors believe that the pandemic has widened this capital gap, which is actually concerning. Now, having said that, 75% of the surveys actually said that a green recovery, which is cutting CO2 emission as part of a build back better approach, is now a global priority. And ASEAN in particular, actually 40% of that panel actually wanted to increase their investments in ASEAN region. If you look at the 10 largest one, actually the 70% of them actually that focuses on ASEAN. So ASEAN is really at the center of this. So Indonesia should take advantage of this. And to be quite honest, actually, just a remark actually that PLN in Indonesia in general actually has been able to attract good foreign investors coming in the effort to diversify the energy mix supply in Indonesia. So example actually would be most recently a real international collaboration between we co-finance the largest floating solar panels actually in Cirata, which is developed actually by Masdar from UAE actually with Chinese contractors actually, and that's the largest in Southeast Asia. So that's really great actually for PLN. Now the second challenge is the nature or the inherent nature actually of realizing or financing green infrastructure projects that match short-term economic goals vis-a-vis the longer-term sustainability needs. So, I mean, you all hear actually about the challenge on the credit appetite in financing energy or power infrastructure. So renewables typically have high upfront cost and low ongoing operating costs, making access to long-term funding is a necessity. Now, this is actually where it lies the problem. Because again, actually, with all of the developing countries in the world, long-term financing is not something actually easy because of the various factors, actually, because of the punitive way, actually, of the capital requirements, actually, to support such a long-term exposures. There is also a tendency, actually, that we haven't really explored, actually, to the fullest, the use of credit enhancements, whether that's actually the ECA side, the multilateral development banks, for example. There's many, actually, examples of that happening already, but the scale is still actually dwarfed, actually, by the requirements and the necessities actually to work on that together. Now, carbon credit, just to touch upon actually that, I think Ibu Sri Mulyani also mentioned about this and Edwin as well, emerging as a cost-effective solution actually for companies. So I think, we applaud the issuance of the carbon economic value presidential regulations actually, and that would set the path actually framework for Indonesia because it has the significant potential to be the superpower and natural-based solution in terms of carbon credit going forward. Now, lastly, actually, my comments actually would be on there's a misalignment also of perception between global stakeholders, NGOs, actually with the global financing institutions in terms of what constitute actually a credible net zero pathways. So Indonesia, you can see actually that has been highlighted, is really the leader in this particular area, actually among the emerging markets with 2060 commitment to net zero, with the transition by 2030 and decommissioning of the coal-fired power plants and so on and so forth. Having said that, there's still critics actually to say that between now and 2030, there will still be an increase in CO2 emissions because of the already commissioned or financial close new coal-fired power plants actually that will go into operations. But the point is actually that energy transition for us actually is not uniform. It's not one-size-fits-all process. It reflects the diverse priorities and entails a combination of abilities, technologies, policies, and achieving what Ibu Sri Mulyani mentioned actually as the just transition is actually very, very paramount, very critical. One where climate objectives are met without depriving developing countries of their opportunity to grow and prosper. This will require capital and actually specialized support. Now, this is some of the fundamentals I can see actually happening in the world, other than what has been presented actually on a more micro level. Back to you, Ranjit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pak Rino, for a very, very insightful summary on the challenges. Let me pass it on to Pak Edwin for perspectives of how PLN sees these challenges. Over to you, Pak Edwin.
Thank you, Pak Ranjit. The Excellency Minister of Finance and MEMR, also dear panelists. Well, we can see the transitions of energy in two ways, Pak Ranjit. So we first can see for the next 10 years based on RPTL, and then the next 40 years we can see from the carbon neutrality projects. So if we see the next 10 years, the challenging is that PLN is in oversupply conditions. In this way, we have a lot of fossil power plants coming into the systems, especially coming from 35 megawatts project and FTP2 projects. So a lot of fossil power plants such as coal power plant and gas power plant coming to the systems for the next 4 or 6 years. So the challenge is how to use the existing power plants to get the renewable energy mix get up to 23%, especially in 2025, and put it 2025 until 2030. So a lot of things that PLN will do based on their RPTL. One of them is that we will use co-firing of coal power plant, that we will use biomass. So instead of use all of the coal in the coal power plant, we will change 10 to 20% of energy primer of coal, changing to changing to biomass. In this way, we will get 3 or 6% of renewable energy coming from biomass. The other things that we will do, that we will change the diesel power plant in the remote area, which is the price is very high right now, around 25 to 30 cents US dollar per kilowatt hours. We will change it to solars and battery. It is possible we introduce battery because the price of them will lower than diesel itself. So the community over there will get a green energy, but the price will lower. And the next step, we will introduce a renewable energy to serve the new load. So starting from 2022, there will be no awarded a new commitment for coal power plant. Everything that to serve the new load will comes from renewable energy. The challenging is, of course, because the renewable energy that available right now, such as solar, it is only available during the day. So the challenging is that can we get the battery to support the system in the low price, because right now it's very high, the price of the battery. So that's our challenging. So for the next 40 years, the challenging is the technology sides. So the coal power plant, we still use the coal power plant maybe for the next 20 or 30 years, but we will use the technology to reduce the emissions. What the technology that is in front of us right now is the CCS or CCUS. So if it is possible to make the use of CCUS, it is possible we capture the emission and we put it in the depleted gas, or helping the gas in the mining of the gas part, if it is possible like that. But the price itself right now is very high. If we introduce right now, it will make the price of coal twice of the coal right now. So the challenge is about the technology. Another thing is this, as I mentioned before, that a lot of solar availability in Indonesia, it is possible we use all of them, but it is only during the day. What is happening during the night? So our challenge is to use the battery. If we use the solid state battery right now, it will cost us around 15 to 20 cents US dollar if we use 24 hours in a day. This is a very high price. So the challenge is how to get the technology and to use the battery so that the introduction of solar and battery can be compared with the coal power plant. So the price is around 7 or 8 cents US dollar. So yeah, we hope, and also we introduce nuclear because if all of the energy availability of renewable energy in Indonesia we put to serve our load in 2060, it is not. We still need new energy coming from nuclear, so it is not enough. So yes, the challenging is about the technology itself, Pak Ranjit. Back to you, Pak Ranjit.
Thank you very much, Edwin. I mean, that was very useful. We'll come back to some of these points regarding technology in the final round of questions. Over to Kam to give us a perspective of the challenges he sees from a large IPP renewable energy producer whose role will be critical going forward. Over to you, Kam.
Thanks, Pak Ranjit, for introductions, and obviously thank you, Selamat Pagi, to everyone, and obviously the keynote speakers as well, yang saya hormati Ibu Sri Mulyani and Bapak Arifin Tasrif. Now, with regards to, I guess, the key challenge in Indonesia, ultimately, when decarbonizing the Indonesian economy, the COVID-19 economic recovery, really needs to ensure that we transition the economy sustainably to ensure that ultimately the future generations can continue to contribute to economic growth. Now, from our perspective, ultimately, when we look at decarbonizing the electricity sector, the four key challenges really is energy affordability, which has been covered obviously largely by the World Bank IEP, how renewable energy can genuinely contribute to the economic growth of the industry in Indonesia, which is, in its fairly early days. The carbon accounting baseline and ultimately the incentives to decarbonize existing assets. And, as per the PLN proposal, to coal-fired biomass is one method of decarbonizing while maximizing existing infrastructure. And finally, the technology knowledge transfer gap that is largely missing, in this story about how do we get the cost of power from renewables to be extremely competitive against existing fuel, fossil fuel production in Indonesia. For us as Pt. REN, we invest, we build, we own renewable energy assets long term across 21 countries. We do think that looking forward the next 5-10 years in the RUPTL, plus also the net zero targets that all global economies are taking today, to work collaboratively in partnership with the Indonesian government to look at low-hanging fruits, because there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Indonesia, the grid consists of so many different parts of the network with different solutions, and we think that decarbonization through looking at energy affordability through microgrids, through larger systems with onshore wind and PV would help us get there. However, what we do need to look at is a long-term carbon abatement policy, which has been proposed for implementation. The sustainability from a financial, economic standpoint is required to create a roadmap that allows IPPs and private sector investment to deploy risk capital to create these projects, because development takes time. So to really invest over the next 5-10 years to help PLN and help the British government achieve its long-term objectives.
Thank you, Pak. I think we'll move to a sort of a slightly modified segment, the second round, where we'll discuss the ingredients as each one of you see it, or the reforms that are needed in order for Indonesia to drive the decarbonization agenda forward. So let's follow the same order, and over to you, Pak Rino, to get a perspective on what reforms, what measures you would like to see in order to open the floodgates of private capital coming in to support the transition.
Thank you, Ranjit. When you talk about reforms, I think Indonesia has really progressed well, relatively. When you talk about policy reform, that's Ibu Sri Mulyani has highlighted. Whether it's fiscal, investment climate, the downstreaming of industries, and so on. So I think the main themes actually for the government here would be to accelerate these reforms, because that's really very key, and also improve sectoral coordination among all the stakeholders, including the ministries, because that really actually is climate change challenge actually for any countries, any corporations, actually a very complex challenge that will require every single parts of that entity to work very closely together. So in order to execute and effective actions to achieve the net zero ambition, actually that is really needed actually for Indonesia. Now, another point actually we see where Indonesia can really play a big part in reform as well as in policy framework is that one of the biggest challenges that is being faced by global financial institutions is the differing or contradictory framework between regions, between countries, that is still happening now that can be particularly challenging to navigate for entities that operate across multiple countries, whether it's investors, banks, other financial industries, that is impeding the rapid scaling of the investment, as I talked about actually earlier, needed to achieve the climate goals. Look, the coordination and interoperability actually are the key things actually here. So as a G20 chair this year, Indonesia should promote international coordination that focuses on promoting the interoperability of different regulatory frameworks, taxonomies, advancing the ability of sustainable finance stakeholders based in different jurisdictions to communicate regularly by sharing and interpreting data across borders. A way to achieve this could be to work on common global principles that could be applied across different jurisdictions to ensure that local frameworks that are to be developed, and it's a continuous development in any case, are aligned with international goals while acknowledging the different pathways towards net zero. Now, more domestically actually focused, we think actually that Indonesia can benefit from the requirement for sustainability disclosures and data. Disclosures will allow financial institutions and the market to allocate capital to activities which are compatible and supportive of the net zero transition. And this will only be possible if there's relevant data that are available, reliable, and standardized. There's a disclosure of emissions, and transition plans are mandatory for all companies. And noting actually that disclosures are fit for purpose, credible and comparable. Another thing actually is incentivization. If you look at the local banking market at the moment, given the situation actually that we've been in, with COVID and pandemic the last 2 years, there's an ample liquidity in the banking sector, as everybody knows. And I think for the government actually to create the right incentivization mechanism for financing in the sustainable area or climate change related sort of projects could go a long way. We see a number of countries actually where risk-weighted assets, RWA calculations actually have been discounted actually for certain projects and so on and so forth, or capital requirements actually is also being discounted actually if you focus on certain sustainable long-term plans. I mean, that would really actually go a long way. On the other hand, though, actually just as a sort of a bit more cautionary sort of comment, if you will, the introduction of punitive capital requirements for climate-related financial risk could have significant unintended consequences on financial stability and the transition to a net zero economy. Last but not least, perhaps, is that, as I mentioned earlier, actually, we applaud actually the government in issuing the presidential regulations on carbon economic value. Look, carbon pricing in general, through carbon emission trading systems in particular, is really a primary mechanism for capital allocation and emission reduction. So it's really great, and Indonesia has significant potential. So I think the comments or the sort of nudge here is that accelerate the issuance of the technical regulations actually from the ministries and so on actually in order for Indonesia to be able to accelerate the development of the carbon trading market locally. Thank you. Back to you, Ranjit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, that was extremely useful in terms of seeing the glass as more than half full and recognizing the reforms that the Indonesian government has already taken, but as well as the call for further action on many specifics that you outlined. I'll move on to Park Edwin just to get his perspective. I mean, he also talked about the number of technology transformation, the needs for PLN. So, if you could elaborate a little bit on the kinds of reforms and the kinds of support that you would like to get from the government and others in order to advance the agenda from the perspective of PLN. Over to you, Park Edwin.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ranjit. Pak Ranjit, huge pressure coming to PLN, especially because we are using right now 60% of coal power plant to serve the energy of Indonesia, Pak. The capacity of them right now are 35 gigawatts, and it will become 44 gigawatts at the end of 2030, Pak. Around 1 or 2 to 3 trillion rupiah, Pak, needed the TOP of 1 gigawatts coal power plants, Pak. So because we cannot put all the investment, the coal power investment coming here without take or pay contract. So who will handle the TRP contract? This is a very serious question, Pak. Because the early retirement, it will need 2 to 3 trillion rupiah per year, Pak. So if and there will be there the coal power will be there for the next 20 or 30 years. So we hope that there will be finance support to PLN if the early retirement of coal should be put in place, Pak. That's the first condition. The other thing is that we will work together with forestry and plantations, Pak, to put the biomass plants around the coal power plant stations, Pak. So it is possible to use them so that make 3 or 6% of renewable energy coming for biomass. Another thing that we should consider is about the technology, Pak. We know that we will build around 250 to 300 gigawatts of new renewable energy coming to the system until 2060, Pak. We don't want that all of them coming from outside, Pak. We will hope that the technology will come from here, Pak, from Indonesia. So that's why we put it is very important to make the industry available in Indonesia, Pak, especially the solar PV that is coming from our sites, Pak, from Indonesia. The price of the capacity for 250 or 300 new power plant will about $1 trillion dollar, or around 600 to 700 billion US dollar, Pak. So it is huge of money. We hope that the technology coming from Indonesia itself, Pak. Another thing is that some of them like geothermal and hydropower plant, we have resources a lot of here, but we still need times to build that kind of technology, Pak. So that's, we hope that by work together with other departments, we hope that it will scrutinize the needs of administrations to get make the process faster, Pak. And last one is about we hope that we also have support from the government, Pak, how to reduce the carbon, because the carbon tax will be put in place, Pak, in next year. Because when we introduce the carbon tax, 60% of our energy coming from solar, it means that the price of electricity will get up. So this is also, we need to have solution for that, Pak. Maybe that's initial conditions, Pak, that should be, that the PLN will face for the next 2 or 3 years, Pak Ranjit.
Thank you, Edwin. I mean, you've laid out quite a long list of measures and reforms that would be needed. It's quite a formidable task ahead, but I'm sure all of you, the policy makers as well as the private financiers, are up to it. Park, I'm just turning to you. You know, in your earlier intervention, you spoke about the need for clarity, in a sense, low roadmap, because many of the renewable energy projects and other ventures take many years to develop. So again, I mean, to develop further on that theme, what kind of support, changes and reforms would you think are the core ingredients in order to bring the large scale up in renewables and the volumes that are expected in order to drive the energy transition? Over to you, Park.
Thanks, Ranjit. I think first and foremost, the latest PLN RUPTL really demonstrates the vision where Indonesia is looking towards a more sustainable, low carbon electricity sector. I think there's always comments that it can always be improved, but the key thing now really is this plan be implemented in a manner which would allow us to establish a long-term supply chain and technology transfer in Indonesia, because that really is the the key factor at the moment in ensuring long-term sustainable growth of this transition. One of the key things to note is that, the private sector investment is not just limited to IPPs who would be, building and developing these long-term renewable assets. There's also the fact that there are end customers today which are, manufacturing equipment or having data centers in Indonesia, which have made global commitments to decarbonize. And, there is both the IPPs, the investors, and the end customers in Indonesia, both willing to work with the Indonesian government to achieve its long-term carbon abatement policy. So I think it's really interesting to note that at the end of the day, there is a convergence between generation and load. And we do want to work with the government to ensure that there is a policy to really facilitate that exchange, facilitate that growth as part of the policy framework that PLN has. I think, on that basis, really is the fact that in the short term, we really look forward to PLN deploying and implementing its RUPTL, its procurement plans over the next, sort of 2, 3, 4 years. Particularly given the fact that, that growth plan we can see in RUPTL was pretty much exponential. So we hope that, in those flagship projects in the next 2, 3 years, we'll be able to contribute to that supply chain, that knowledge exchange, which will drive that cost of energy down across, the main grids, but also the more remote networks where diesel replacement, is that priority project that PLN has at the moment.
Thank you, Pak. I think you've raised some very important specifics in terms of how you would want to work with entities like PLN in looking more at that demand and matching it with certain interventions from the private sector and what is needed to fill that gap. I am conscious that we are running out of time. So in the interest of that, what I'm going to do is ask each one of you, perhaps, we've gone over the challenges and you've been very, very insightful in your interventions in terms of the measures to be taken, could be taken, and the partnerships that need to be developed, amongst all sides of this equation. I shouldn't call it an equation, but, it's a fairly complex optimization here between government, lenders, private sponsors, and private investors. So if I could ask each one of you, perhaps, if there's just a couple of points that you would like to emphasize or raise in closing from your perspectives, again, putting you in the shoe of lenders, financiers, the core utility, the state utility, which will be purchasing much of the power that's coming in from renewables and being quite responsible for the transition, and from the private investors in renewables. So in that same order, Pa Rino, Pa Edwin, and Pa Kam, over to you. Your last 30-second intervention, please. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ranjit. I think actually very clear that collaboration is the key to this. Now, from our perspective, actually, the banking and capital market sector plays a critical role in this transformation as an intermediary between the supply and demand for capital, as a lender, arranger, investor. So financial institutions such as Standard Chartered, in our case, actually can play a key role in channeling capital to areas which are needed the most, actually. And as the only international bank, as an example, in all 10 ASEAN markets, we're able to intermediate between the emerging economies that are most in need of investment with the more developed economies that can provide that investment. We've also announced our ambitious new interim 2030 targets for the most carbon-intensive sectors and our methodology for a pathway to net zero by 2050. This includes our plan to cut finance emissions and mobilize $300 billion in green and transition finance by 2030. Now, success in mobilizing both public and private capital by the banking and capital market sector to finance climate transition pathways will only be achieved by a holistic complementary sets of actions taken by the public sector, social sector, the real economy, and the broader financial sector. So again, cooperation between governments, multilaterals, development banks, agencies, and the private sector will be pivotal. I think my last word is that we must act now. We must act together. Companies, consumers, governments, regulators, the finance industry must collaborate to develop sustainable solutions, technologies, and infrastructure. Now, good intentions are the first step towards sustainable change, but now is the time to translate strong words into bold action. Really, back to you, Ranjit.
Thank you, Pak Rino. I think your closing comment, yes, it really is high time to translate all these good intentions into action. And we all look forward to working with all the actors around the table and all the ones we heard from to move that forward. Over to you, Pak Edwin.
Thank you, Pak Ranjit. Well, right now PLN handle the electricity, Pak Ranjit. But for the next year, PLN will handle the environment, Pak. So this is a different kind of playing field, Pak, of course. So the first things that PLN hope that by working together maybe with World Bank and other institutions that we can invite the investor coming to Indonesia, Pak, coming to PLN, because we are in the oversupply condition right now. So we are ready to serve a lot of demand right now, Pak, especially in the huge system in Indonesia and Sumatra. The other things that we cannot work by ourselves, Pak, to reduce the coal, to reduce the emissions, Pak, we need help, of course. That's why we will do the unconditional part by doing the LPTL, but we can also need help in the conditional one to take off the TOP of our fleet, Pak. And the next one is about the technology itself, Pak. We hope that everything that coming from renewable energy, especially from solar, it can come from our nation's power in Indonesia. So that's why we put a huge part of TKDN, Pak, in the solar. We hope that the technology, the industry will grow in Indonesia so that we can be leader in our country, ourselves. Thank you, Pak Rajit.
Thank you, Edwin. Yes, you've stressed the point on the technology, and I guess both PLN and the private sector will play quite a lead role in bringing these new technologies in. So thank you for your intervention. Now I'll pass it on, the last word, to Kam, and maybe he might reflect a little bit on the point on what roles the private sector would play in driving these renaissance of these new technologies. Over to you, Kam.
Thanks, Paranjan. I think, the IEP roadmap, and along with the policy side with the Indonesian government has sort of laid up in front of us, gives us a roadmap, a view of, how exciting the next decade will really be in Indonesia, where we can really test and deploy, potentially very innovative solutions, given, the genuine challenge we have in transitioning the electricity sector in Indonesia. Now, we have obviously there's microgrids of renewables, and we're looking at green hydrogen and green ammonia just round the corner at the back end of this decade. There's a lot of opportunities that really exist in Indonesia, where we're talking about ambitious projects, importing power across nations around Southeast Asia, but even potentially from Australia. And I really think that from our side, we're really interested in very, very genuine in the commitment to decarbonize Indonesia's electricity sector, and also the transportation aspect as well, which is the next sort of key challenge in the low carbon economy. And the challenges that PLN faces today, we do think that over the next 10 years, private sector along, which is IPPs, consumers, and also financiers, will definitely be there to support PLN in that process. And again, the roadmap and the policy side, it's really shaping up from our side to really deliver that innovation that the sector has been lacking in the last decade.
Thank you, Pakam, and I do hope that collectively all of us would be able to help support and define this roadmap with the government. So thank you all for your interventions. I'm going to hand this back to Timothy. Thank you all.
Moderating our panel discussion today. Thank you once again, Pak Ranjit, and also we thank all the panelists, Pak Edwin, Pak Kamho, and also Pak Doni for being our panelists today and providing us a very insightful discussion that you have had here today. Now, this panel discussion also marks the end of the IEP launch today. If you're interested to receive the detailed report, it can be downloaded at worldbank.org/IEP. And don't forget, you could get the latest information regarding World Bank's programs via our Twitter account at Bank Dunia. Now, for our journalist friends, we will hold a press conference right after this. You could join by using the press conference icon on your screen. Thank you everyone for your attendance. My name is Timothy Marbun, and on behalf of the World Bank team and everyone involved in this event, we hope to see you again in the next launch of the Indonesia Economic Prospects Report. We wish you all a safe holiday season. Goodbye.